It seems like lecture after lecture by this point in the semester. We seem to be inching ever so close to civil war. Well, today we're actually going to get pushed over the edge. You are going to see some bullets start to fly. You are going to see some battles emerge, right? Um, I want to begin this conversation with a reiteration of what Lincoln's election meant to the South. Okay, I had said this before that from the perspective of a state like South Carolina, they had no other alternative but to secede. There's a lot of reasons for this, but Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, being the party to undo slavery, limit where it can go, what it can do, this directly threatened South Carolina's way of life, and South Carolina made it pretty clear if Lincoln was elected, they would secede from the Union. Okay, they were men of their words. You're looking at Abraham Lincoln's inauguration in 1861, and at that particular moment, the South Carolinians had issued something called the Ordinances of Secession. Okay, what an ordinance of secession is a formal declaration dissolving any affiliation with the United States. Essentially, what South Carolina did is it just withdrew from the United States. That's essentially what an ordinance of secession is. Now, in the aftermath of Lincoln's election, there is some time before he takes office. At this particular moment, the moment that you're looking at on the screen there, they've already left. Okay, they have already left. So in between his election and his swearing in, Buchanan is still in the White House, and I've told you that he's not a great president for a lot of reasons, and this is probably the biggest one. When South Carolina seceded, there were other people that were tossing this around in their mind. Should we secede? Should we stay? What's going to happen? That sort of thing. So if you're Buchanan, what you want to do, if you don't want these people seceding, what you want to do is you want swift and decisive action when it comes to South Carolina. You either feel that secession is legal and let them do what they want to do, or you don't and you punish them swiftly and severely. Buchanan said that secession was illegal, but there really wasn't anything he could do about it. I mean, well, you know what he's saying. This is Lincoln's problem now. I don't have to deal with this is Lincoln's problem, right? So if you're sitting back, if you're Alabama, if you're Louisiana, you're sitting back and you're thinking, is now a good time to secede? Yes, it's a very good time to secede. And the reason why is South Carolina did it and Buchanan didn't do a thing about it. So if there's ever a time to get out of the Union, now is the time to get out. So within a month after South Carolina left, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and after a long debate, Texas also issued ordinances of secession and dissolved their affiliation with the United States. I want you to think about what those states had in common. Think about their economy. What they all had in common was the institution of cotton, right? Keep in mind, I did not say Virginia. Virginia has not seceded yet. And there's not a coincidence that cotton doesn't grow in Virginia. Secession meant different things to different states. And certainly it's not a coincidence that all the states that got out early ultimately had cotton as the basis of their economy. But even this late in the game, there are people that are desperately trying to save the Union, including a guy from Kentucky by the name of James Crittenden. Crittenden proposed a compromise which would ultimately come to bear his name, the Crittenden Compromise, which proposed taking that Missouri Compromise line, the 36th 30th parallel, and extending it all the way to California. And yes, of course, the North would have access to more territory and consequently more states. But on the one hand, at least the South would get some new states. And on the other hand, the Crittenden Compromise also suggested that any new territories that would come into America's possession after the compromise went through would be eligible for slavery as long as they were south of Missouri. Think about this. What countries can you think of in Central America, in South America, that are south of Missouri, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, Brazil. All of those things are very hospitable to some of these cash crops that would really lend themselves to slavery. And so Lincoln rejected the Crittenden Compromise wholesale by saying what this is going to do is unleash unrepentant warfare on the peoples of Central and South America. So, no, I reject it. And for the good of the order, the South rejected it as well. It had already made its peace, and now it's time for choosing, right? Let me explain what's going on here. Even after Lincoln has been sworn in as president, there are federal fortifications, military bases all across the South. And they're beginning to be annexed. They're beginning to be taken over by what is coming to be known as the Confederate States of America. These are the states that have issued ordinances of secession and left the country. As a matter of fact, by the summer of 1861, there's really only one holdout. That's a fortress that's off the coast of South Carolina. It's called Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was basically under siege, and its commanding officer, the Union officer, said, "I will surrender within 3 days with dignity and honor." And within those 3 days, Lincoln wanted to make sure that all of his troops, keep in mind those are Union federal troops, he wants to make sure they're okay. And so he let South Carolina know, I am going to sail a ship into Fort Sumter. This is not an act of war, and it's definitely not an act of aggression. Really, all that's on that ship is food. I'm just making sure that my guys have enough to eat. That's it. That's all. Well, the ship comes into Fort Sumter's harbor, and South Carolina fires upon it. This is an act of aggression, right? You could say that it was an act of self-defense, but ultimately, it's firing upon federal property. That's kind of a violation, at least where I come from. You have to understand that what Fort Sumter does is not only starts the Civil War, what it does is it galvanizes the remaining slave states. There are numerous ones, and I'll talk about them in a minute. It convinces them to either secede or stay within the Union. I want to start out with those states that you're looking at on the PowerPoint there that are yellow. That would be Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Now, I want to say something about Maryland and Delaware. I don't really think that there was ever much of a chance that either one of those states would have seceded. But when Fort Sumter was fired upon, the few fence sitters that were there, they rallied to Lincoln's cause. They thought that this was absolutely absurd that you would do something like this, and if anything, this pushed both Maryland and Delaware into the corner of Abraham Lincoln and the Union. To a lesser extent, it does the same thing in Kentucky and Missouri. Now, both Kentucky and Missouri are slave states. Slavery is not nearly as popular, as powerful there as it is in a state like Mississippi, but there's still some people that are on the fence. And for the most part, the same thing that you can say about Maryland, the firing upon Fort Sumter rallied people to the cause of the Union, that same thing happened in Missouri and Kentucky. Now, Lincoln said that it was absolutely essential that he keep Kentucky. And if you look at that map, you can understand why. It touches 3 border states. It touches 2 Confederate states, or eventually Confederate states. It's right centrally located in the middle of that map. Anything that you're going to do, it's going to come through Kentucky. And so Kentucky was very important in that capacity. Missouri might even be more important in that way. The Mississippi River runs north and south down Missouri's eastern border. And the reason that's important is that the Civil War is really going to be the first ever modern war in human history, meaning that it's not just about winning battles, it's about a strategy. You've got to supply your armies, you've got to reinforce them, and that involves transportation. And nowhere was there a bigger, more important mode of transportation than the use of the Mississippi River. And you're going to see how and why this is going to be so consequential here in just a few minutes. But the states that are in lighter red, not the deep south, I'm mousing over them right now. These states right here, Those are the states that I want to talk about next. Collectively, that would be Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Um, a couple things that I want you to understand about these states. These states are very, very important to the Confederate cause, and here's why. Number one, two-thirds of the white population lives in those states. If you're going to fight this war, you're going to need warm bodies, and those warm bodies are not located in Mississippi. You need Virginia, you need Tennessee because they bring population into your cause. Secondly, the few factories that do exist, they don't exist in Georgia. They exist in the northern part of the South, in Virginia, in Tennessee. That's where stuff gets produced. And keep in mind, this is a modern war. You've got to outfit and equip your army. You need the northern South for that. Last but certainly not least, you need to feed your army. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever been able to feed an army based on cotton. What they grow in Virginia is things like wheat and corn. They raise cattle, they raise hogs, and all of these things you can use to feed your army. So it's really, really important for the Confederacy to get these four states. And fortunately for the Confederate States, they see the North as the aggressor by sailing that ship into Fort Sumter. Had Lincoln left them alone, might not happen. In any case, all four of those states will issue ordinances of secession, and you now have the lines that are firmly drawn. All we need to do now is fight the first battle. Before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about strategy and objectives. The guy that you're looking at there on the screen, that's Jefferson Davis, one-time senator from Mississippi and now president of the Confederate States of America. And he makes this very clear pretty early on. The South is not fighting for conquest. It's not fighting for any greater ideal. It's fighting for independence. It's fighting to be left alone. This is a little bit of public relations, but the one advantage that the South has is similar to the Americans in the Revolution. It doesn't need to win the war. It only needs to avoid losing it, having its armies obliterated or its leadership captured. As long as it can do those two things, or avoid those two things, it'll live to fight another day. And just like with the American Revolution, the longer this thing drags on, the more likely it is that the North is going to be willing to negotiate some semblance of freedom, some semblance of independence. From Lincoln's vantage point, I want you to make sure that you understand this. Its goal is to preserve the Union. Lincoln felt that secession was illegal, and the reason that they're fighting the war is to bring the South back into the Union. To bring the South back. You're not hearing me say something. You're not hearing me say anything about slavery. And that was not by, accident. Lincoln desperately wanted it to be seen as a war to preserve the Union, not a war to end slavery. Keep in mind, he's got 4 slave states. He doesn't want to upset them. He doesn't want to bring bigger, broader ideals that might isolate some people and not get them to participate in the affair. The first battle of the Civil War is going to be very consequential, not necessarily for the outcome, but certainly for the duration of the war. And that would be the Battle of Manassas on the Manassas Creek in Virginia, or it's more commonly known as Bull Run. It's important that you understand that both sides thought that this was going to be a quick and decisive affair. That's always the way that it goes in war. It's never you that's going to take a bullet. It's always that poor other fool on the other side of the battlefield that's going to die, right? The Union Army had been drilling and drilling and drilling for months, and they were desperate for a battle, and they finally got one in 1861. And the Battle of Bull Run didn't go badly at first for the North. The problem is they're new troops. I mean, it's one thing to drill, and it's another thing to actually take heavy fire. And when new troops, inexperienced troops, start doing that, start taking heavy fire, they panic, and the North panicked. And they didn't retreat. Retreating is orderly backing up to get a better strategic advantage. They straight up fled the battlefield. It was said that it took them 3 months to get to Manassas, and it took them 3 hours to run all the way back to Washington. But more importantly, what I want you to understand about Bull Run, not only is this a very, very decisive Southern victory, it demonstrates something to Lincoln. It demonstrates that this is going to be a long, bloody, costly war. And it was at that point that Lincoln called for 3-year enlistments, understanding that this was going to be a long, drawn out process. I am not much for military history. That's not really what I do. But there's another battle that I need you to be mindful of, because not only is it going to shed some light on what's going on in the war, but it'll also get you to understand what maybe needs to be done for the future. The Battle of Antietam is going to be the bloodiest day in American history. Now, keep in mind, part of the reason for that is that both sides at the end of the day are American. But the thing about this is that the main commander that Lincoln has commissioned, it becomes pretty clear to Lincoln that he's the problem. The guy that he's commissioned is a guy by the name of George McClellan. And McClellan had graduated top of his class. He was a really good X's and O's kind of a guy, but he never really wanted to engage the enemy. You have to understand that the North had a huge advantage when it comes to population. Lots of numbers on their side. Keep in mind, the factories were located in the North. Most of your transportation routes were in the North. Every strategic advantage that you had, this was on the side of the North. Okay. McClellan actually came across the battle plan of the Confederate Army days before the Battle of Antietam emerged, and he assumed it had to be a trap. There's no way that anybody would be this stupid. They were. It was the battle plan that the main commanding officer, a guy from Virginia by the name of Robert E. Lee, planned to execute, and actually did execute, in the Battle of Antietam. And McClellan just sat on his heels. The other thing I need you to understand about Antietam, this is in Maryland. And yeah, Maryland's a slave state, but it's a state that never seceded. What that means is that Robert E. Lee is actually going on the offensive, and he's trying to win the war. Keep in mind, he doesn't have to do that. He can just fight a defensive war. What he's trying to do is punch through Antietam, and then he is within a stone's throw of Washington, D.C. He does that, the war is over. Now, Lincoln doesn't have a victory from 1861 to 1862, not one of real significance that he can point to. Antietam is going to be the exception. I wouldn't say that the North won the Battle of Antietam. I would say it was a draw. Now, if you want to get really technical, the South left the battlefield first. Lee retreated back into Virginia. So technically, Lincoln's able to play it off as a victory, but generally speaking, all it really did is it prevented the end of the war. I wouldn't really point to that and say, we're very close to victory, because they're clearly not. But that's in the East. I want you to keep that in mind, that the East and the West, they're not created equally. And although you don't hear about them in many textbooks, and you wouldn't have read about them in newspapers at the time, it's really in the West that the North is going to win this war. Let me explain. What you've got in the West that Lincoln never had in the East in 61 and 62, really even in 1863, was competent leadership. Who he's got in the West is a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. I'll give you an easy way to remember him. U.S. Grant, Unconditional Surrender Grant. You'll see what I mean here probably in the next lecture. Grant is going to execute some just brilliant maneuvers in these battles in the West, which is going to give the North a huge strategic advantage. And it's not going to show up in 1863, maybe not even in 1864, but believe me, these Western victories are going to pay dividends a little bit later in the conflict. A few examples. Forts Henry and Donelson were located in central and western Tennessee. And ultimately, very early on in the conflict, Grant is going to capture these forts and by consequence, western Tennessee. As I've already pointed out, Tennessee is a very important state within the Confederacy, and it fell pretty early in the war. Speaking of things that were pretty important, New Orleans. Not only is New Orleans the biggest city in the South, it's also the financial capital of the South, and it too falls very early in the struggle. What Western Tennessee and New Orleans have in common would be the Mississippi River. You're seeing more and more of a Union domination of the Mississippi, and that will get even furthered by the Battle of Shiloh, which is located in northwestern Mississippi. This is a very unlikely but also very important Union victory with Grant. Grant is victorious at the Battle of Shiloh primarily because he doesn't retreat. He engages the enemy. Unlike McClellan in the east, he actually stands toe to toe and he inflicts heavy casualties. Now, the Battle of Shiloh is really, really important because what's happening is there's a noose that's tightening around the Confederacy's neck, right? And the noose is the Mississippi River. That window is closing rapidly, and pretty soon it's going to be cut off entirely. And when it does, you're going to see the Confederacy cut in two. That might not mean very much to you right now, but when we talk about Vicksburg in 1863, that is going to be a very big, very important battle because it's in 1863 that you see the Confederacy cut in two, and the momentum is clearly on the side of the North. But I want you to make no mistake about it. Right now, the South is winning the war. And if the war were to end in 1862, then the South would have won the war. Morale is very low. Lincoln is struggling mightily with this morale. Not only is the war going poorly, the Lincolns, as in Lincoln and his wife Mary Todd, lost their middle child, Willie, to an illness. And so he's just beset by grief. And on top of everything else, the South seemed to be destined to victory. It got Lincoln to say that he felt that even the Almighty was against them. But 1863 is going to be an important turning point. Not only is it going to be an important turning point because you're going to see some success in the battlefield, although you will, the nature and the purpose of the Civil War is going to change in that year. It's a watershed moment in a lot of different reasons. Of course, military, but I would also very, very much argue political as well. You'll see what I mean the next time we meet.